I recently played through Bloober Team's Blair Witch game that released in 2019 to poor review scores. Based on these scores, I really wasn't shocked that upon my completion of the game that I felt pretty similar. However, what did shock me was that it was very much apparent to me that the developers seemed to have no inclination on what made this franchise so special in the first place, adding in whole elements that were completely irrelevant to its core formula and themes while also not taking inspiration from games that came prior and dominated the camcorder style gameplay and horror that would have very much benefited this game. Today we are diving into everything Blair Witch, including the impact the movies had, what they did well, how future movies made the games possible, a look at the lore, and most importantly, how the Blair Witch game got it all so wrong. Now look, you don't even have to be an avid horror buff or a cinephile to know how much of an impact the Blair Witch Project had both culturally and within the world of film, even if you just heard about it in passing, which is most likely if you're younger. It popularized the found footage genre, and without it, analog horror may not be as prevalent as it is today, and it's hard to say if we would have critically acclaimed games like the Outlast series in its absence. The first movie grossed a whopping $248 million worldwide, placing it atop the mantle of found footage horror all these years later, still yet to be claimed. That's really including the 14 Paranormal Activity movies. I'm not actually sure how many there are, but there's a ton of them, and the first one was the highest grossing one, and it totaled $194.2 million, so the Blair Witch Project still has it beat by a pretty wide margin. The roaring success of the seemingly one-off movie spawned two questionable sequels and an uninspired game, one that has been forgotten to time since its release 5 years ago. Much like any continuation, the Blair Witch game's narrative resides within the same timeline as the first movie, evident by the radio recalling the first film's trio's disappearance in 1994 during the opening cinematic, placing Ellis's journey into the woods in the not-so-distant future year of 1996. So, in pursuit of this goal, today we will be looking into the films. To anyone not so familiar with the source material, no need to worry, for I'm going to be breaking the movies down, which means that there will be spoilers for the following: the Blair Witch Project, the Blair Witch 2016, and the Blair Witch game. You have your warnings. And if you noticed, I'm missing a movie that's for good reason, and
she's the witch, man!
Yeah. 1999's The Blair Witch Project set a high standard within the film industry, showing studios and filmmakers alike what was possible while operating on such a small budget of just $60,000 with lower-end tools like the HI-8 camcorder in replacement of the heavy-hitting, less mobile older brothers, which were typically used on film sets to get the best quality possible. But the thing is, The Blair Witch Project really wasn't aiming to wow audiences with its clear, sharp images nor its over-the-top effects. The scale of the movie, even when compared to others several decades before, was scaled back to its simplest form, which follows three film students as they make their way into the Maryland Black Hills forest in the pursuit of creating a documentary-like film. One that's main focus is on the old folklore tales of a phantom that haunts a forest just outside of a small town, Burkittsville. A man by the name of Rustin Parr was convicted of doing unspeakable things to younger people in the 1940s, systematically taking them out in pairs of two, having one stand in a corner of the basement of his house while he took the other's life. When asked why he did such a terrible thing, he stated that the Blair Witch commanded him to do it and then allowed him to leave the forest once his bidding was done, thus birthing the legend of the Blair Witch. Heather, Mike, and Josh venture onward into the woods, despite the claims of the witch being real by the local townsfolk, which honestly is really relatable because who would really believe all that crap? I know I wouldn't, and I know my friends wouldn't. Deep in the woods, the trio search for and discover the landmarks spoken about in the fables, most notably a place called Coffin Rock, where the souls of 5 men were taken in the 19th century by ritualistic fashion. These stories relatively leave the group unaffected, and what otherwise starts off as a trip filled with laughs and banter, pretty quickly spirals into a nightmarish set of events as the trio hear sounds in the distance at night and awake to find twisted stick figures and markings surrounding their campsites. Further escalation resulting in physical movements of objects around them and Josh's abrupt disappearance on the 5th night. It's a really slow burn film where hardly any concrete evidence to support the claims of the witch are shown, due to in part its analog nature, but also it was their intent to build terror and suspense around the unknown. There are no on-screen theatrics, no CGI or creatures lurking in the dark. There's not even a haunting soundtrack. In fact, there are rarely any disturbing sounds throughout the movie, with the one standout being children's laughter. The only thing you'll really find on the screen that isn't footage of people talking and walking is a smidge of blood Heather finds and a gift left at the tent's entrance. So it doesn't sound too scary, does it? But it is, because it nails down a lot of the key pillars of horror, subjecting the audience to their own fears and phobias. It creates a lurking sense of paranoia. There is reluctant dread of the unknown, and lastly, a display of verisimilitude, meaning that the movie and its setting present a real-world facing viewpoint. And by rule, the more believable it is, the scarier the results will be. It wouldn't be even half as effective as it is without the acting and the found footage angle. Found footage isn't just a particular way to stylize a movie from the lens that moves organically with whoever's holding it. It allows the audience to feel like they are part of what is happening by having that relatable lens. You aren't simply watching from the safety of your home or theater seat, you are in this with the trio trying to survive the unsurvivable. The terror really comes from the slow mental decay of the main cast and the hopelessness that envelops them. It's so effective because the cast isn't actually acting a majority of the time. Their reactions to events are genuine because the film crew told them nothing, only giving them information by way of GPS caches where they would fill them in on the context of the scene and tell them where to go, but not tell them exactly what they were going to find or what was going to happen. When Josh disappears at night, that's a pretty crucial story moment in the movie. He just kind of walked off in the middle of the night while the other two were sleeping because he was told to do that.
If he was at the river, he could hear me from here.
No!
Josh!
There was no actual official script, so the movie was built off a majority of improvisation, which makes their dialogue and banter come off grounded and natural, because it is. When you take that into consideration and then you realize that the writers produced a fake setup and documentation surrounding 3 missing students, going as far to have local paper companies write up news reports of missing students along with the myth of the Blair Witch, it's no surprise it is as effective as it is, even today when the jig is up. The movie itself really explained nothing. It gave us a simple setup and said these guys went into the woods and their footage was found a year later and their bodies were not. Not one aspect of the film has a solid conclusion, which doesn't typically work in movies because you want some kind of payoff, but for some reason from a real world angle it works here. The whole movie is a build up to the end. You don't know if they are going insane or if they're just lost in the woods or if there is a curse that is actually real until the end when the story comes full circle. Mike is standing in the corner, just as the townfolk and the fables had said. Several years later, the 2016 movie came in and threw a bunch of stuff at the wall to see what would stick. These additions would intentionally set a definitive answer for the lore, showing that the elusive phantom was in fact real, and in the process establish the rules in which she plays by, ones that allow her to possibly control time and space both in and out of the woods. Because if there's anything that we like in our modern day movies, it's cheap plot devices that force a story to unfold instead of having one organically unfold. The movie's events are prompted by a YouTube video of all things, and isn't that kind of ironic from where I'm sitting? James is Heather's brother, and when he finds a video online suggesting that his sister could be alive even though she's been missing for 20 years, which is just not even possible, he gathers his friends and together they once again go into the woods looking for her. Nearing the end of the movie, it's revealed that the girl in the video James saw on YouTube was in fact footage of the events that are currently unfolding, implying that the events that take place were destined to happen from the start and that the group, or alternating timeline versions of them, would be stuck in an endless loop, a concept that we will return to because it plays a direct role in the game. Aside from the concept of time manipulation, the witch can also manifest physical forms that's actually terrifying. But in lieu of having the film be one long, sustainable build-up of tension to the final riveting act like in the original, Blair Witch 2016 fixates on the constant peaks and valley method of delivering its horror by having an over-reliance on cheap jump scares with little build-up and payoff. Also, another relevant element we will return return to. Oftentimes, the movie just has multiple of these jump scares back to back, simply of characters running into frame of the camcorder mixed with sharp technological sounds emanating from the camera, which is a far cry from the original cast and their acting that heightens their struggle without the need for jump scares at all. Overall, it presents a less interesting cast of characters that don't have memorable interactions with each other. What made Heather, Josh, and Mike's journey so believable is that over time they turned on each other out of stress and desperation to get out of the woods, even though their hope was slowly diminishing. I'll admit, the last 30 minutes or so of the 2016 film had me almost over the rail scared because of its relentless roller coaster of horror that focuses a lot more on the buildup of the atmosphere and tension with minimal jump scares. The claustrophobia in the house is greatly expanded upon from the first movie, appearing more capacious than what looks possible based on the exterior size, which builds up its psychologically intense conclusion. Nevertheless, what 2016 brought to the table inadvertently led to the possibility of a game that could share the same universe. You can't really have a game based on the Blair Witch where you're simply walking around the woods hearing things and arguing with your fellow hikers because, well, that wouldn't be compelling, no matter how in-depth that elevator pitch was. Yet you could create a game that takes advantage of the physical threats that hunt you, the voodoo dolls that are actually tied to physical people, constant morphing of the environment, and then temporal manipulation to create something along the lines of Outlast. And well, that's nope, wait, no, they really just did the walking thing.
Oh, brother, this stinks!
Okay, I think it's fair to say that at this point in time, Bloober Team isn't exactly what some might call a highly prolific studio known for their creative works. While they have shown they are quite talented, this sentiment was only bolstered by their gameplay reveal of their upcoming Silent Hill 2 remake that I was initially really excited for, but now, well, not so much. They really hit a stride with Layers of Fear. Sure, it was just a walking simulator, but the psychological story was pretty interesting and the tortured artist added some interesting layers. Get it? Cause Layers, okay. Observer is by far their best game in my opinion, and it's not even really a horror game. In fact, the worst parts of the game is when it's trying to force horror onto you. You can clearly tell that Layers of Fear was their bread and butter. It's what got them on the map because they decided to remake both games that, let me tell you, didn't really need a remake. There was no talk of a remake for the Blair Witch game, and that's probably for good reason. It's not good. It's not even a case of it just being a bad Blair Witch game, which it is. It's really just not an effective horror experience, nor does the Bloober Team's rudimentary formula lend itself well to this franchise. Not only does it provide a weak gameplay experience, but it presents a convoluted story with no payoff. The worst offender being its forced themes that replace the main antagonist of this franchise. You know, the one that without we wouldn't have a franchise at all. I believe the name is, the Blair Witch? Not Rolling Leafs, the game, or Twig Monsters hopped up on Ritalin. I'm pretty shocked to see some leaf enemies in this game as an enemy type in a Blair Witch game, but you know, I've kind of gotten used to it a little bit, but now that that shock has subsided, I'm shocked that they're growling at me. What is this game? So you take those elements, you throw them in a pot, you add a dash of unlikable protagonist, a teaspoon of trauma cliche, and a sprinkle of poor horror design, and what you come up with is a concoction of disappointment by Bloober Team's making called the Blair Witch game. Now it's obvious upon my completion of the game to get both endings that the developers really only looked into the 2016 film when forming their concept of the game. There are hardly any influences from the first film that you can actually find here, the only real nod being the camcorder you find and use throughout the game. It's supposed to be the same forest, so I figured maybe I'd find Coffin Rock or the cemetery with rock piles and stick figures, but nothing. And look, it's not really a bad thing, because like I said before, Blair Witch presented scenarios that showed a potential for a game, so why wouldn't they focus on that movie? It's just that the team really only took a couple of cool concepts from the 2016 movie, the time manipulation and the rust and par house, choosing to build the rest of the game around some of the film's worst aspects, only further amplifying them by how out of place they felt in the context they show up in. I'm of course talking about the abhorrent jump scares, which I'll get into in a few minutes, but we need some setup first. The game focuses on main character Ellis and his companion service dog Bullet as they join a search party for a missing boy that wandered into the Black Hills forest. For reasons that are explained later in the game, Ellis feels a personal guilt guilt and responsibility to see the boy safe. When he arrives, the local law enforcement are already way ahead of him, prompting Ellis and Bullet to head in alone. Wasn't that a mistake? Now, the movies are really simple in their narrative structures and setups. A group of people go into the woods searching for something while ignoring the folklore there and getting sucked into an inescapable set of circumstances where the only two outcomes are either death or eternal servitude to the witch. There really doesn't need to be any major plot or revelations to contextualize this because the movie is pretty forthcoming with what is happening without having to show the viewers. There is a lot of people dying and a lot of people getting hurt. These movies were never about the unraveling of one's trauma or a look into mental illness. I understand that having a character laced with trauma and guilt is a horror staple, with most plot outcomes being a metaphor for the character overcoming their past to come out on the other side reborn and yada yada yada, but that's never something that is explored in the Blair Witch mythos. In a franchise that is solely about a ghostly presence using the forest to ensnare and drive her victims crazy, here we have a game that applies a serious real-world illness that takes the form of PTSD and uses it merely as a vessel for scares. I'll be damned, these guys really don't know how to build any effective scares at all, and I'll be seeing that another 7 times before the game is over. Making it the real focus and monster instead of, you know, the Blair Witch. The opening cinematic of the game shows 2 young boys walking into the woods. That seems pretty significant. Well, to find out what significance this holds, because the game won't elaborate on this at all in the story, the player has to find notes scattered around the woods that tells the story of an unnamed person's therapy records who seemingly has a connection to the forest since getting lost in the woods as a child. You don't really have to think too hard to find out that obviously this was Ellis, being the beginning of Ellis's trauma, making it back out alive alone while his friend was never found. This untreated trauma would have worked really well as the basis for the story. The further Ellis goes into the woods, the more he remembers what happened, the more flashbacks we have as him as a child running through the woods being chased by the witch. So what sounds better here? What I just proposed, or military flashbacks that have gunfire and mortar shelling of all things happening in the middle of the woods, which is entirely irrelevant to the witch? It doesn't help that Ellis is written in such a way that makes him very unappealing. He's let himself go and his trauma is slowly ruining his life. He's struggling, and because of this, at face value, we're supposed to feel bad for him. The thing is, it's hard to do that when the game seldom presents scenarios that show his good side. It's not like he's even caught in the cycle of abuse, but rather someone who is actively creating that lifestyle and that cycle for people around him, including his ex-girlfriend, who we never see the face of because the team obviously didn't want to spend time and money animating the faces. But let's be honest, if I can't see her face, it lessens the connection and the emotional impact of these scenes.
Ellis, I can't do this anymore.
What? What is it this time? What, I wasn't smiling enough? Didn't say I love you for 5 fucking minutes?
Jesus Christ, Ellis, do you even hear yourself?
Yeah, I can hear myself just fine.
There was never any attempts from the game to get you to care for him. He treats everyone like a punching bag, taking 2 steps back, apologizing to them, and then taking another step forward to undo his prior apology, more or less repeating the cycle of abuse.
Hey, don't talk to me like I'm crazy.
Well, what do you want me to say, Ellis? That it's all fine and dandy? Because I sure as hell tried that, and it didn't work.
Screw you, Emmett. I don't need your help. No, it's you who needs me. Now, I'm the only person in this goddamn forest who is even remotely close to finding that kid.
There are tons of morally complex characters that do terrible things in gaming, but they have redemption arcs or times where their compassionate side can linger. Arthur Morgan, Silence, Joel, Kratos, I mean the list really goes on, there's a ton of them, and I'll tell you who's not on that list. Ellis. You can reach out to various characters in certain parts of the story by way of phone or walkie-talkie, and I did this in my first playthrough, but my second playthrough I just really chose not to do this because Ellis sucks and I'm not going to subject others to his poor behavior just because I want some meaningless story. I also found it very disingenuous to the portrayal of PTSD because it has nothing worthwhile to say about it. No matter the ending you get, Ellis will die and there is no way of helping him, insinuating that there is no longer a point in fighting. It's actually really quite depressing for all the wrong reasons. Now, naturally, progressing the story unveils more of Ellis's misconducts, and you get to see that this man really can't seem to do anything right. He's brought into the military by his father, he then fumbles his military leadership abilities abilities, in the process getting a significant portion of his unit killed in an ambush. He's later dismissed by dishonorable discharge, going on to become a police deputy for a local sheriff because he feels bad for him. When responding to a robbery, he shoots an unarmed robber that turns out to be the older brother of the kid that goes missing later on, Peter. The sheriff then decides to assign him Bullet in hopes that the dog will help him cope, which eventually leads to the start of the game. Just before Ellis dies, we get another glimpse into his life, which is really just driving home the fact that there is not a single reason to care about this man. This time, the flashback shows him taking the life of a woman in fear of getting caught by advancing forces during his tour. This guy just sucks, and having him die right after this is very fitting if you get the good ending, but not in the way I think the team wanted it to resonate with players. But hey, if they really wanted people to hate him, I'd say they did a really good job, like 10 out of 10. For the story to work, Ellis has to either die or become part of a time loop I mentioned earlier, a plot device that the team quite obviously took from the 2016 film. While James and his friends regain hope that Heather might be alive because of YouTube videos that anyone could really make it, I never really stopped to consider how stupid that actually is. But anywho, unlike that movie, Ellis is brought to the woods with a motivation to do some good, to find Peter. The further in he goes, the more clues he gets to Peter's whereabouts. It appears that he's been taken by some unknown assailant, a man by the name of Carver that Ellis encounters in the second half of the game. When we meet Carver, you can tell that he's quite twisted. He's been in the woods for a long time, and it turns out that he's not just a puppet for the witch, but he is a corrupted Ellis, and depending on the ending you get, you'll either kill Carver and yourself, ending the loop, or you'll kill Carver and become him, thus continuing the cycle. Now I'll be frank, I am not a huge fan of the time loop gimmick, which I'll explain momentarily. How they introduce Carver, however, and add subtle nods about his identity is quite clever. If you look close enough, Ellis will find a used box of cigarettes in the forest as a clue as to who he is looking for, the exact same box and brand Ellis has on his truck dash. When you encounter Carver for the first time, Bullet doesn't perceive him as a threat, and this next one is perhaps over the line of subtle and into the territory of dead giveaway.
First, let the mud sniff the symbol. He'll take you right where you need to go.
How? The only scent he'll get is my own.
Just do it.
But regardless, it's one of the facets of the story I find most appealing. It's just that everything else around it fails. Carver becomes the main antagonist of the second half of the game, trying to get you to bend to the witch's will, and depending on whether you choose to listen to him or not, there are outcomes that you never actually see play out. He'll give you a gun and tell you to kill a bullet. So anyway, finally we have a gun and okay. He really just becomes an instruction giver rather than a menacing or scary villain. You'll hear the witch's voice occasionally, but Carver is clearly in the spotlight. What his conclusion did nail is that it's just like the movies. There is no happy ending for the main characters, capitalizing on the hopelessness. You aren't running away from evil into the light at the end of the tunnel. There is no escape, nor is there any signs of hope. It's just that the story really loses focus midway through. You're looking for a kid, but between Ellis's constant fight with PTSD, his blatant guilt flashbacks, and the introduction of Carver, Peter just kind of gets lost in all of it. And unlike Heather and friends, Ellis isn't likable in the slightest, which lessens or completely diminishes the impact. None of the effects of your outcomes are shown in any satisfactory way either. A whole lot of game time is spent to see a black screen with minimal text telling the player what outcomes their choices had. Yet funnily enough, the game was built with multiple playthroughs in mind because there are slight variations outside of the two main endings, so why have such a cheap conclusion with no payoff? Peter was saved? Cool. It's a good thing we get to see him reunite with his family or see the police pick him up from the woods. Oh, Bullet survived and now he's been wandering around someone's house? That's cool. Can we get like a news broadcast on that and their search for Ellis? You know, something? The Blair Witch Project was incredibly effective and alluring without these plot devices. The witch as an entity is a lot more menacing when she was a threat that was totally avoidable, only acting in malice when provoked. Their actions led them into a scenario which they couldn't escape, and there were no external factors at play aside from their own curiosity, also adding the situational regret and dread. If they hadn't have tempted fate, they would still be alive and none the wiser, but nothing they can do in in that instance can change their fate. The idea that the witch's power and pull is omnipresent lessens the impact because the main characters now have a predetermined fate by factors out of their control. It's the difference between coincidental horror and premeditated horror. This may sound like a stretch, but she's no longer really a believable threat. She's simply a plot device so that we can have a movie and a game that takes away any significance from the narrative's pull. Especially when Bloober Team wants players to return to it for other endings, and now we're going to talk about how the canonically good ending forces players to actually disengage with many of its systems. So if it wasn't a dead giveaway, the issues don't end with the story or how at odds it is with the themes of the franchise. The gameplay is a whole other beast, presenting ideas that at face value seem very thought-provoking and compelling, but all of which inevitably fall flat on their face in execution while poorly informing the player of what repercussions their actions actually have within the story. The game wants players to believe that there are many mechanics at play and that your actions throughout the game will have impactful, lasting effects. Seriously, I mean, the game even tells you this in regards to Bullet, stating, "This is Bullet, your right-hand dog. Listen to his barking and watch his body language. He'll be the first to alarm you of any trouble, but he'll need your help to deal with it. Remember, the way you treat him can affect his behavior later in the game. Stay close to him. Prolonged loneliness can affect your mental state," which technically is true by his behavior changing based on how you treat him being solely relegated and displayed in an end cutscene. As I've mentioned before, there are two major outcomes of the story, and how you attain the good ending is hidden within the game, found on notes that subtly hint at what you need to avoid doing, which means that from your first playthrough, the player is set up to fail entirely, and how they push this on the player unabashedly asks you to disengage with almost all of its content that raises it slightly above just a walking simulator. How they go about this is directly in conflict by how even Bullet reacts to certain items you aren't even supposed to touch, and accidentally interacting with any of these in a walking simulator immediately nullifies your chances of getting a good ending.
What's the matter, buddy?
Wooden figurines to collect? Nope, don't grab those. The hex is hanging from the trees that Bullet doesn't like? No, don't touch those. The monsters lurking in the woods? Yeah, don't fight them. Don't even interact with them. In fact, don't even use your flashlight, because even if a smidgen of light graces a single leaf on their barked laced figures, it's over. Are you kidding me? You best be joking. You best be joking. Instead, just walk by them using the camcorder. Don't interact with anything in the infamous Rustin Power House at the end of the game except the wooden figures that you actually have to grab, and whatever you do, do not leave Bullet behind in the never-ending loop of caverns. You know, this moment actually would have been quite impactful if the loop didn't go on for a solid 10 minutes. So it's not 10 minutes, but I actually had to go back and use a stopwatch on this segment because I just couldn't believe, I was just dumbfounded by how long it is. And it's actually 6 minutes and 43 seconds of me just walking in a continuous loop with nothing else happening. That's how this game respects the player's time. It's just pathetic. It's testing your morality. Cool. By continuing the loop and refusing to leave Bullet behind, you're showing that you're better than the witch. You are defying the witch. And then the game says, oh yeah, actually you have to leave him behind anyway, which just makes the whole 10 minutes redundant. So if you finish the game and you want to go back and get the good ending, which good on you, because I regretted it, what incentive does it really give the player? The incentive is absolutely nothing, because now it is strictly a walking simulator with hardly any world interactions. It lessens what little horror there is here, and it really makes the player feel more like a viewer than a player. The reason Layers of Fear was actually scary, despite it being a walking simulator, was that the player was confined to claustrophobic environments, which allowed the team to use the setting in creative ways. You never knew what was around the next corner, so the team could create sinister labyrinths. Closing a door and opening it again revealed whole new layouts, and it adds ways of masking these transitions thanks to visual barriers. It truly made you feel like the painter that was going crazy, even if it was a tad bit overdone by the time the credits rolled. The expansive forest really doesn't allow any manipulation like this, so the team had to find other ways to make the game scary, which seemed to put them in a predicament of not knowing how to truly scare the player without incessant and insulting jump scares. There's nothing like walking around the woods and then suddenly getting shot by an imaginary gun in a Blair Witch Witch game, which just so happens to ruin the tension the game is building in that moment, and in that regard, the game is almost identical to the 2016 film. Wow. Good one, guys. To further compare these two mediums, the 2016 film actually has creature design and scenes which display a physical threat. So too does the game, and the first time you stumble upon one of these standing in front of the tree, it's truly terrifying. Its abhorrently tall stature combined with its inhuman trembling is imposing. You can't really quite make out its features because it's blending in with the forest around it. So you do what any rational person would do, you whip out your flashlight to see what it is, and bam! It scurries into the trees before you can catch a glimpse, but wait, it's not over. Well, it begins barking and growling at the trees that surround you. The wind picks up and you can hear twigs snapping, almost as if multiple assailants are circling in on their prey. It's hunting you from the thick brush. You hit it with the flashlight once more before it retreats for good. This is how you introduce a threat. It's unexplainable. It happens so fast you don't even know what to think, and now you don't know if you can feel safe again. That thing could still be out there. What was it? And if it is still out there, when will it come back to get you? So an otherwise strong encounter quickly divulges into a predictable pattern of what the game likes to call combat, which is really just pointing your flashlight at tree guys during certain staged encounters, which I don't think would have been all that bad if the in-between of these moments had actual tension, subtle scares, and general unease with how vulnerable you should feel in an open space like the middle of the woods. There were constant sounds at night in the Blair Witch Project, some as simple as brush crackling under someone's feet, and others that elicit much more fear, like the disembodied screaming of Josh for help. It's a ploy to mentally exert the two remaining survivors with no other intention. It's just them in that moment having to cope and try to make sense of something that has no plausible explanation. There's so much one could do with sound here alone. Like, I made it a point in both of my playthroughs to actively seek out details in the environments, thinking maybe I'd see a shady looking figure in the trees watching me, or maybe hearing sounds of children's laughter behind me with the pattern of footsteps treading through the leaf-laden ground. Instead of carefully crafting moments like this, they constantly are in your face with aggressive flashbacks. The gameplay really doesn't take any liberties with the Bloober team formula. There is a lot of walking through woods, listening to your dog bark, growl, or yawn, reading notes, talking on the phone, and reading text messages, solving incredibly straightforward puzzles and environmental puzzles that involve bending time. An idea that is single-handedly the most intriguing concept, but they never utilize it that much. It plays a direct role in the lore, so it makes sense to have it here. If the witch can bend time, why can't we? If she can weaponize it against her victims, Ella should be able to do that too. And well, no, it's just used for a handful of minorly inconveniencing environmental navigation obstacles. It ends up adding a layer onto the camera that gives you incentive to use it, but it's not an object that you need to rely on consistently up until the end of the game. It has night vision, but it sucks. You can't see 3 feet in front of you, and raising it up to get a decent image of what you're looking at slows your already meandering walk to a crawl. But hey, if you want to get the good ending, you pretty much have to use this thing throughout the whole game as a substitute for the flashlight. Typically, when gamers have a complaint in relation to a game's length, it's really regarding how it's too short, especially when it's a full price game. Blair Witch is a short 5-hour game, yet it feels so much longer, and there aren't too many games I can say that about. It severely lacks the incentive to keep the player engaged by how much downtime there is. It's clear that they didn't know how to fill these gaps with the elements horror games have been implementing since their inception. I should never feel safe in the Cursed Woods. Heck, you know it's embarrassing when the Slender Man games did it better. Having the final mission take place in the Rustin Bar house is without a doubt the best part of the game, and the devs knew it, simply because it allowed them to build tension in unsettling moments by diving back into their comfort zone like I mentioned earlier. They now have enclosed spaces and corridors to hide ever-changing environments. Heavy breathing and footsteps can be heard on the other side of walls, and it's just really creepy. If they had just released this section of the game as a one-off snippet, I think it would have done great. But because you've already been walking around bored for 4 hours, it falls apart 20 minutes into its 60-minute duration. For a brief moment, it finally captures what the Blair Witch is all about, and then... Jesus. Yeah, fuck this game. If that doesn't prove that they never really understood the Blair Witch in the first place, I don't know what will. And that's all for this video. Like, sub, comment, and let me know. Are you excited for the Silent Hill 2 remake, or are you as worried as I am? Good night, and good lunch.